The Southern California sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the dust and noise of the construction site. It was a world of raw creation, filled with the high-pitched whine of power saws cutting through wood and the steady, rhythmic clang of metal on metal. The air was thick with the earthy smell of fresh concrete and the sweat of men earning their living under its glare. They were building a wall, a massive partition of cinder block and mortar that was slowly snaking its way around a new luxury community. On the other side of the temporary chain-link fence, another world existed in aseptic silence. Manicured lawns, too green to be real, stretched out before cold, modern mansions that seemed to watch the labor with impersonal indifference. The wall was more than a structure. It was a physical border between the hands that toiled and the lives of untouchable opulence. Among the crew, Arthur was a figure of quiet constancy. At 58, his face was a roadmap of long days spent under that same sun, and his hands were thick and calloused, tools shaped by a lifetime of hard work. He wore simple, cement-stained clothes that seemed to be a part of him, a second skin of his trade. His movements were efficient and deliberate, each lift of a block, each spread of mortar, a testament to decades of practice. There was a tired resignation in his posture, the look of a man who understood his place in the world. But in his eyes, if one cared to look long enough, there was a deep, quiet melancholy, a sorrow that had built its own wall around his heart years ago. He was a builder of barriers, a man who spent his days separating worlds, yet he was an island of loneliness himself. Every day, like a clock striking an invisible hour, a small boy would appear on the other side of the fence. At precisely 3 in the afternoon, Leo would walk to the edge of his perfect lawn and stand there, a silent observer. He wore expensive clothes that were always slightly askew, a collar upturned or a shirt untucked, as if no one ever paused to straighten them for him. His eyes, a startling shade of blue, were a window into a rich and curious inner world. He never made a sound, never tried to get anyone's attention. He simply watched, his focus absolute, as the chaotic jumble of materials was transformed into an orderly, impenetrable structure. To him, the workers were not just men, they were magicians, and Arthur, the one who always worked closest to the fence, was the chief of these powerful wizards. Arthur had noticed the boy weeks ago. At first, he was just a flicker of color in his peripheral vision, a distraction from the heat and the ache in his back. But the boy's persistence was unwavering. As the days turned into weeks, Arthur began to see past the designer clothes and the grand house looming behind him. He saw the boy's profound isolation, a stillness that felt achingly familiar. He was a lonely child on one side of the fence, and Arthur was a lonely man on the other. The wall he was building with his own 2 hands suddenly felt like a cruel irony, a monument to the very separation that defined both of their lives. It's stories like this that show us the invisible barriers we live with every day. And if you believe they need to be seen, subscribing to our channel helps us to keep telling them. The quiet melancholy in Arthur's eyes was a ghost from another life. A life that had ended abruptly 15 years ago on a winding country road. His son, Daniel, had been 17, full of the kind of easy laughter that could fill a room and a passion for rebuilding old engines. One rainy Tuesday, a truck had hydroplaned, and in an instant, the laughter was gone forever. The silence that followed had been absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered every corner of Arthur's small house. He and his wife had drifted apart in their shared grief, 2 ships passing in a fog of unspeakable pain, until she eventually moved away. Arthur stayed, surrounded by the ghosts of what was, and began building walls around his heart. Using bricks of routine and mortar of quiet resignation, ensuring no one could ever get close enough to cause that kind of damage again. His life became a simple, repeating loop: wake before dawn, drive to the site, work until his muscles screamed, and return to an empty house where the television provided the only voice. He never spoke of Daniel, not even to his co-workers. The boy's memory was a sacred, painful thing he kept locked away. But sometimes, when he saw a flash of youthful energy or heard a distant laugh, the lock would tremble. The pain wasn't a sharp sting anymore. It was a dull, constant ache, a part of his very foundation. He saw himself not as a man who had lost a son, but as a man who was fundamentally incomplete, a structure with a missing cornerstone. This quiet suffering was the lens through which he saw the world, a world of temporary structures and inevitable goodbyes. On the other side of the fence, Leo's world was a fortress of a different kind. His mansion was a marvel of minimalist architecture, all glass and polished concrete, but it felt less like a home and more like a gallery where he was a forgotten exhibit. His father was a phantom, a voice on a speakerphone from a distant city, while his mother was a whirlwind of social engagements, her affection delivered in hurried pats on the head. They loved him, he knew, but in a distracted, abstract way. They provided him with the best of everything, tutors, therapists, organic meals, but they never gave him the one thing he craved, their quiet, undivided presence. His room was filled with expensive, educational toys that lay untouched, their bright colors a stark contrast to the grey loneliness that filled the air. Leo's mind worked differently. The world, with its loud noises and unpredictable emotions, was a frightening storm of chaos. He found his refuge in patterns, in the predictable rhythm of things. The construction site was his sanctuary. It was a place where chaos, piles of sand, stacks of blocks, buckets of water, was methodically transformed into perfect, unwavering order. He didn't see dirt and noise. He saw a beautiful, logical process unfolding. Arthur, with his steady hands and calm demeanor, was the master of this process. He was the anchor in Leo's chaotic world, a figure of dependable consistency who brought order from disarray. Watching him work was the only time Leo felt his own internal storm begin to quiet, replaced by a profound sense of peace and fascination. The daily ritual of sharing lunch became the unspoken centerpiece of their days. Arthur began packing his old metal lunchbox with more intention, adding an extra apple or a small bag of cookies, placing it carefully beside his turkey sandwich. He would sit on an overturned bucket, and Leo would sit cross-legged on the pristine grass, the chain-link fence the only thing between them. Arthur would pass a piece of fruit through a gap in the fence, and Leo would accept it with a solemn nod, his blue eyes never leaving Arthur's face. They rarely needed words. Arthur would point to the mortar mixer, then mime the stirring motion with his hands. Leo would watch, his focus absolute, occasionally pointing a small finger at a tool as if asking a silent question, to which Arthur would respond with a simple, demonstrated answer. Their bond was built in these quiet moments, a language of shared glances and simple gestures. Arthur found himself talking more than he had in years, his voice a low, gentle rumble as he explained the difference between a trowel and a float, or how he made sure each line of blocks was perfectly level. He wasn't sure if Leo understood the words, but he saw the understanding in the boy's intense gaze. For Leo, these lessons were more valuable than anything his tutors taught him. He was learning about creation, about strength, about how a man's hands could build something solid and true. And for the first time, he felt seen. He wasn't a problem to be managed or a diagnosis to be treated. He was just a boy, sharing lunch with a friend. Arthur soon realized, with a jolt that both warmed and terrified him, that his 3 o'clock break with Leo had become the anchor of his own day. The morning's labor no longer felt like a burden, but a prelude. The afternoon's fatigue was no longer a weight, but a countdown to that shared moment of peace. He was building a wall, yes, but his true work felt like it was happening through the fence. The quiet boy had chipped away at the mortar around his heart, letting in a sliver of light he thought was gone forever. Sometimes the deepest healing comes not from forgetting our pain, but from finding a new reason to care. Sharing these journeys of connection is what we're all about, and your subscription is what makes it possible for us to continue. But with that light came the shadows of fear. A cold dread would creep into Arthur's thoughts as he drove home. What would the boy's wealthy parents think if they knew? They would see a grimy old construction worker, a stranger, feeding their child through a fence. They wouldn't see the shared loneliness or the simple kindness. They would see a threat, a liability. The worlds they inhabited were separated by more than just a wall of cinder blocks. They were separated by a chasm of wealth and suspicion. He was a man who earned his living with his hands, and they were people who lived in a world he could only build, never enter. This fear made him cautious, but it wasn't enough to make him stop. An even deeper fear haunted him in the quiet of his empty house. He was growing to care for this boy, a feeling he had buried with his son. He recognized the familiar pull, the paternal instinct to protect and nurture, but this connection had a deadline. The wall would be finished in a few more weeks, the crew would pack up, and he would be gone. Leo would disappear from his life as suddenly as he had appeared. The thought of that silence, of that empty spot on the lawn at 3 o'clock, was a terrifying echo of the loss he had already endured. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the warmth of attachment could lead to the devastating fall of another goodbye. One afternoon, a community security guard doing his rounds noticed the daily ritual. From his air-conditioned vehicle, he saw not a friendship but an anomaly. He saw a worker interacting with a resident's child, a clear breach of protocol. He didn't see the gentle smiles or the shared understanding. He saw a potential risk, something to be documented and reported. He took a photo on his phone, typed a sterile, impersonal note about unauthorized contact, and sent it to the community management, who in turn forwarded it to Leo's parents. The report was cold and clinical, stripping the interaction of all its humanity and leaving only a stark warning about a stranger and a vulnerable child. The reaction was immediate and severe. Leo's mother, already stretched thin by a demanding schedule and anxieties about her son's condition, saw the report not as a moment of connection, but as a failure of security. Alarmed, and with no context for the bond that had formed, she and her husband forbade Leo from going anywhere near the construction site. It was a swift, decisive action born of fear and misunderstanding. For Arthur, the next day at 3 o'clock brought an aching void. The perfect lawn was empty. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy and final. It's heartbreaking how a pure connection can be so easily broken by fear. If you believe these moments of quiet truth deserve a voice, please consider subscribing. It helps us bring more of them to light. The days that followed were torturous for them both. Arthur's lunch breaks became tasteless, his gaze drifting constantly to the empty space where Leo used to sit. The rhythmic clang of his trowel felt hollow, the purpose drained from his work. The wall, now nearing completion, seemed to mock him, a monument to the very separation that had been forced upon them. Inside the cold mansion, Leo's world crumbled. The one point of order and connection in his life had been severed. His carefully constructed peace shattered, and he began to have severe anxiety meltdowns. His parents, unable to understand the source of his distress, tried to soothe him with new toys and digital screens, but it only made things worse. They had taken away his sanctuary and had no idea how to build him a new one. The turning point arrived with the sky. One afternoon, the relentless California sun surrendered to a bruised, purple sky, and the heavens opened up in a torrential downpour. Inside the mansion, the storm was mirrored in Leo's heart. The prohibition from seeing his friend, compounded by days of isolation, finally broke him. It was not a simple tantrum, but a meltdown of profound, silent anguish. He bolted from the house, a small, barefoot figure running into the deluge. His expensive clothes instantly soaked and mud-splattered. He ran toward the one place in his chaotic world that made sense, the one place he felt a sense of order and peace. He ran toward the wall, toward the memory of his friend, his parents' panicked shouts lost in the roar of the rain and thunder. The construction site had transformed into a dangerous landscape of slick mud and deep, murky puddles. Stacks of cinder blocks became treacherous islands, and piles of rebar jutted out like metallic snares. Leo, driven by an instinct he couldn't name, found a small refuge, a crawl space between pallets of bagged cement, shielded slightly from the worst of the rain. He huddled there, shivering from cold and emotional overload, lost in a world his parents couldn't enter. They searched frantically, their voices thin and desperate against the storm. Their perfect, orderly world had dissolved into primal fear. The fear of losing their child in a place they had paid to have built, but had never truly seen or understood. It was his mother who, in a moment of pure desperation, remembered the security guard's report. The stranger, the old worker, the man who had somehow connected with her son, leaving her husband to continue the search. She ran, heedless of the mud ruining her designer shoes, toward the small trailer where the crew took shelter from the storm. She burst through the door, a frantic, rain-drenched apparition. The men stared, shocked into silence. Her eyes scanned the room and found him. "Arthur!" she cried out, her voice breaking with a sob she could no longer contain. "Please! It's my son! He's out there! He's gone! I can't find him! Please! You have to help me!" Arthur didn't hesitate for a second. He grabbed his worn jacket and his metal lunchbox and followed her out into the storm. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet, focused determination. He moved through the site with a familiarity born of long labor, his gaze scanning the shadows and hiding places. He found Leo huddled behind the pallets, his small body trembling. Arthur didn't call out or rush toward him. Instead, he calmly walked over, the rain dripping from his grey hair, and sat down on the wet ground right beside the boy. He said nothing. He simply opened his old lunchbox, the metallic click, a familiar sound even above the rain, and held out half of a simple turkey sandwich. Leo's frantic trembling subsided. He looked at Arthur, and in his blue eyes, a flicker of recognition and safety returned. He slowly reached out and took the offering. Watching from a few feet away, Leo's mother collapsed into tears of overwhelming relief and utter bewilderment. The therapists, the specialists, the expensive programs, none of them had been able to reach her son in moments like this. Yet this man, this stranger, had calmed the storm with a simple piece of bread. When she found her voice, it was a raw, humbled whisper. "Why? Why does he listen to you? What did you do?" Arthur looked away from her and down at the boy, who was now calmly eating the sandwich, his small hand resting near Arthur's knee. He looked back at her, his gaze gentle but clear, holding the weight of a truth she was only just beginning to understand. "I didn't do anything, Mom," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the rain. "I just shared my lunch and my time." That evening, after the storm had passed, Arthur sat in a living room that felt more like a museum than a home. His muddy work boots, which he'd insisted on leaving by the door, were a humble testament to the world he came from. Leo's parents, their composure shattered, didn't just apologize. They asked him questions, their voices stripped of authority and filled with a raw, desperate need to understand. They wanted to know about his lunches, about the silent language he shared with their son, about what he saw in Leo that they had somehow missed. Arthur spoke simply, without accusation, describing the boy's intense focus and his fascination with order. He wasn't a hero or a savior. He was just a man who had taken the time to see. And in the sterile quiet of that mansion, his simple presence was a profound lesson in the art of paying attention. In the final weeks of the project, a new ritual formed. Leo's father began leaving his office early each day, not with a sigh of obligation, but with a flicker of genuine interest. He'd stand with Leo at a safe distance, both of them watching as Arthur laid the final courses of Block, the father. A man accustomed to the abstract world of spreadsheets and conference calls began asking questions about mortar consistency and the importance of a level line. He was learning about his son by learning about the world his son found solace in. The wall, once a stark symbol of the divide between their lives, became a bridge. It was no longer a barrier separating a worker from a resident, but a shared point of focus that was helping a father and son rebuild their own fractured foundation, one conversation at a time. The day the job was finished, the air was thick with the bittersweet finality of departure. The sounds of saws and hammers were replaced by the clatter of tools being packed away. Arthur felt that familiar, hollow ache returning, the quiet dread of an impending goodbye. As he prepared to leave, Leo's parents approached him. Their expression serious but kind. They offered him a job, not as a temporary contractor, but as the community's full-time groundskeeper and maintenance supervisor. They spoke of his skill and integrity, but the true reason was left unspoken, hanging in the air between them. They weren't just hiring a handyman, they were choosing to keep a friend, a mentor, and the quiet architect of their family's healing. For Arthur, it wasn't just a job, it was an invitation to stay, to belong, to finally come inside the walls he had so carefully built. 5 years later, the Southern California sun cast a warm, gentle light on a community garden bursting with color. Arthur, now with more silver in his hair, but a deep peace in his eyes, showed a teenage Leo how to stake a tomato plant. The boy, taller and more verbal now, listened intently, his hands working alongside the old man's with a familiar, shared focus. Not far from them stood a handsome new building, its sign reading, "The Arthur Project," a workshop funded by Leo's parents that taught practical skills to young people with ASD. It was a legacy of kindness, a testament to how a simple, shared lunch had torn down a wall and built a future. It's stories like these, of bridges built where walls once stood, that remind us of what truly matters. Your subscription helps us continue to share these quiet triumphs and honor the connections that change everything.